The night Evelyn Carter lost everything, the city outside her window looked exactly the same as it always had. 43 floors below, San Francisco moved through its rituals, taxis crawling through the financial district, office lights blinking off one by one, ordinary people finishing ordinary days. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass of her corner office in the Nexora Tech headquarters and pressed 2 fingers against the cold surface, as if the city owed her something. It didn't. Nothing did anymore. The stock ticker still scrolled across the television screen mounted on the far wall, and the number beside her company's name had lost 31% of its value in the past 48 hours. 48 hours. Not a recession, not a market correction, a betrayal. And somewhere in the static wreckage of a Tuesday that had begun like every other Tuesday, Evelyn Carter understood, for the first time in her professional life, that she had no idea what to do next. Evelyn Carter had built Nexora Tech from a second-floor walk-up in Palo Alto, with $40,000 borrowed against her mother's house, and a pitch deck she had revised 117 times. By 33, she had been on the cover of 3 national business publications. By 35, Nexora's AI infrastructure platform served clients on 5 continents and was valued at $4.2 billion. She was not lucky. She was not charming. She was relentless in the way that only people who have survived true scarcity can be, with a coldness to it, a deliberate quality, as if warmth were a resource she had calculated could not be afforded. She ran board meetings the way a surgeon runs an operating room. No sentiment, no improvisation, no unnecessary conversation. People who worked for her respected her. Some feared her. Very few liked her. She had decided a long time ago that liking was not the point. Liking was what people settled for when they couldn't command something more durable. She had commanded more durable things. Until 48 hours ago, the point had always been the company, and now Marcus Webb, her CFO of 6 years, the man she had trusted with access to every system Nexora owned, had been quietly selling user behavioral data to a competitor for 14 months. The SEC filing came through at 7:43 in the morning on a Tuesday. By noon, 3 board members had publicly called for her resignation. By 4 o'clock, her own access credentials had been revoked, not by a regulator, not by law enforcement, but by the board itself. Her board. The one she had handpicked. The one she had grown from 3 members to 9 over the course of a decade, believing she was building a circle of people who understood what Nexora was supposed to stand for. The share mommy. Like Kim, 22% in the first 4 hours. By close of market it was 30. As a phone rang shy and stopped, and, which was worse, she knew what the silence meant. The people who called when things were good didn't call when things were criminal. They simply stepped back and let the story tell itself. And the story, right now, was not hers to tell. The television screen mounted in the corner of her executive office was playing cable news on a channel she rarely watched. And across the bottom of the screen ran a ticker that said, "The Fall of Evelyn Carter." She stood and watched those words scroll past 3 times. She did not change the channel. She thought she owed herself at least that much. The discomfort of watching it stated plainly. Without the cushioning of a public relations team or a legal advisor or any of the institutional infrastructure she had spent 12 years building specifically to prevent moments like this one from reaching her raw. The anchor on screen was using the word embattled. Then the anchor said allegedly, which Evelyn's attorney had told her was the word that mattered most in these situations. She turned the television off and stood in the dark office for a while. The city outside glowed orange gold through the glass. She had a penthouse apartment 12 blocks away, and she was not ready to go there, because there was nothing there that would help. She remembered something then, a specific afternoon, 14 months prior, that she had filed away under the category of problems that resolved themselves through organizational force. She remembered the afternoon Noah Bennett had walked into a board meeting he had not been invited to. He was not supposed to be there. He was the building's facilities and maintenance coordinator, a fact that had struck her as absurd the moment she saw his face in the doorway of the 38th floor conference room, a broad-shouldered man in a gray work shirt, completely calm, holding a single printed page. He had laid that page on the table and told the board, in plain language with no prepared remarks, that the data-sharing arrangement the CFO was proposing for the platform's third-party integrations would expose Nexora to systemic fraud. He had used the phrase structural backdoor. He had cited 3 specific technical vulnerabilities, each with a timestamp indicating when it had been introduced into the system. He spoke for 4 minutes, without pausing, and without looking at his paper. When he finished, the room was silent for a full 5 seconds. Then Marcus Webb said something measured and dismissive about the appropriate channels for facilities concerns, and 2 other board members smiled, in the particular way of people who have already decided how a situation will resolve, and Evelyn had looked at Noah Bennett across the conference table and made a decision she would spend the next 14 months refusing to examine. She had looked at security. She had nodded. She had let them walk him out of the room. 3 days later, she signed his termination papers herself. The last thing he said to her, standing in the hallway outside her office while his employee badge was being processed out, was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "One day you'll understand," he said. "This company won't fail because of the technology. It'll fail because of the greed." She had not responded. She had walked back to her desk and opened the next item on her calendar, because that was the kind of person she had trained herself to be. That was 14 months ago. Now she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, the investors, the advisors, the legal team, the 3 people she had privately considered friends. She did not call any of them. She already knew the texture of what each conversation would contain. And she could not tolerate right now the particular species of pity that comes from people who once wanted something from you. She stood in her dark office for another few minutes, and then she thought about the only person who had been completely, documentably right when she had been completely, documentably wrong, and who had said so to her face, and who she had thanked by having him escorted out of a building. She told herself she was not going to drive to his house. She was in the parking garage 20 minutes later. The address she had for Noah Bennett was from his HR file, still accessible on her personal device before the system lockout propagated fully through the server chain. She drove herself no driver, no assistant, no security detail she could no longer afford through the evening commute and into a neighborhood on the eastern edge of the city she had no memory of ever visiting. The streets were quieter here, older buildings with visible maintenance and small businesses with hand-painted signs and the particular kind of lived-in character that neighborhoods develop when they haven't been renovated for aesthetics. She expected to find a rundown apartment or a modest rental property, the geography of a man recovering from the economic disruption of a sudden unemployment. What she found instead was a clean, well-lit auto and technology repair garage occupying the corner of 2 side streets, with a hand-lettered sign above the bay doors that read Bennett Systems, and inside, through the partially open roll door, at least 4 people working with quiet efficiency under bright LED panels. The equipment visible from the street was not cheap. There were 2 diagnostic workstations with monitors she recognized as high-end. There was a rack of servers visible through the inner office window. She sat in her car for a full minute and adjusted her understanding of the situation. Then she got out. Noah came out of the garage without being summoned, as if he had heard her pull up, or as if very little surprised him in general. He was wiping his hands on a cloth and wearing the same kind of gray work shirt he had worn the day she had him removed from that conference room. He looked at her car, then at her face, and his expression did not shift in any of the directions she had anticipated. There was no visible satisfaction. There was no smugness, which she had expected and had even prepared a response to. There was no warmth, but there was also no anger. No cold wall of accumulated resentment. None of the emotional positioning she had steeled herself to navigate. He simply stood there in the light from the garage, calm and self-contained, and let her speak first. She told him she needed to talk. He held the door open. That was the moment Evelyn Carter understood, for the first time in longer than she could track, that she was in a room with someone who wanted absolutely nothing from her, and that she had no strategy prepared for that. She learned, in the 2 hours that followed, sitting across a workbench from him, while the garage settled into its end-of-evening routines around them, things about Noah Bennett that she had not known, and perhaps had not wanted to know. He had a daughter, 9 years old, who was apparently asleep in the small apartment above the garage. He had been raising her alone since the girl was 2 years old. After a marriage that had ended not in drama but in the quiet, inclusive way of two people who had grown irreconcilably different in their understanding of what a life was for. He spoke about this without self-pity and without the faint performance of resilience that people sometimes deploy when discussing hardship in front of an audience. He stated it as fact, the way he stated most things, and moved on. He had degrees in electrical engineering and software architecture from institutions she recognized, but had not known he attended the kind of degrees that don't end up in facilities management by accident but by a specific sequence of choices and circumstances that she had never thought to ask about. He had taken the maintenance role at Nexora deliberately, he told her, because he had been interested in the company's infrastructure from the inside before deciding whether to pursue a technical position there. He had been planning to apply for an engineering role when the data situation became apparent to him, and he had made the decision to go directly to the board instead of working through proper channels, which he acknowledged had been naive from a political standpoint. After Nexora, he had spent 8 months building a small AI security consultancy out of this same garage, working evenings after his daughter was in bed and weekends when she was at her grandmother's house 2 neighborhoods over. The firm had recently received a formal valuation from a private equity group she respected at just under $320 million. She absorbed that figure and let it sit for a moment. He watched her let it sit. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. Eventually, he set a second coffee mug on the workbench in front of her. Without being asked. "You didn't think about me at all," he said. It wasn't contemptuous. It was accurate, and they both knew the distinction. She told him the full version of what had happened, not the press version, not the one she had reviewed with her attorneys, but the one she had not told anyone, the one that included all the specific decisions she had made over 4 years that had made the betrayal possible and inevitable. The compliance flags she had overridden. The internal audit recommendations she had deferred. The specific Tuesday afternoon she had understood that something was wrong with the data agreements and had opened her laptop and looked at the problem for 40 minutes and then closed it and prepared for an earnings call instead because the earnings call was certain and the problem was still deniable. She told him all of it. He listened without interruption, without the expressions of a person managing their reaction for effect. When she finished, she asked him why, after everything, he had not gone to the press or the regulators with what he knew when it happened. He said he had a daughter to raise and no interest in making himself into a story. Then she asked him what she was supposed to do now. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her a question she had not been remotely prepared for. "If you had the chance to do this again," he said, "would you be trying to save the company? Or would you be trying to save yourself?" The question sat between them like something with physical weight. She opened her mouth and found she did not have an immediate answer. He did not press her for one. She did not sleep that night with any clarity about what the answer was. Her car would not start when she tried to leave. A dead battery, nothing more theatrical than that. No symbolism she could have arranged. Noah said there was a cot in the back office and she was welcome to use it. She came within a breath of declining and then accepted. Because she had nowhere she wanted to go, and because pride was a resource she had just discovered was not infinite. She lay awake for a long time on that cot, listening. Through the gap in the office door she could see the blue light of multiple monitors and hear the low murmur of a video call being conducted in careful technical English, with people in what sounded like a distant time zone. She thought about what kind of person builds a $300 million company in a garage above his daughter's bedroom, without making it a public narrative. She thought about all the times she had made her own ambition into a public narrative and what it had ultimately served. She thought those two approaches said something about the difference between them that went deeper than career strategy. She fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning to the sound of someone still working and slept better than she had in months. In the morning, he set a check on the workbench in front of her coffee cup. It was a business check drawn on a Bennett Systems account, properly signed, with the amount line left completely blank. She looked at it for a long time without picking it up. Then she told him it was a cruel thing to do. He told her it wasn't. He told her that money alone couldn't save Nexora. The board had already structured the legal exposure to be diffuse. The public trust was genuinely damaged, and no single financial intervention was going to reassemble what the company had been. but it could give her the runway to do something real rather than something reactive. She asked him what separated those two things. He said the difference was whether she was prepared to let the company become what it should have been the first time around, rather than what it had become. She stared at the check. "Why would you do this?" she said. After everything, he looked at her steadily across the workbench. "Because the company failing doesn't hurt me," he said. "The people who work there do." She picked up the check. Her hand was not entirely steady. He refilled her coffee and went back to his workbench, and she understood that the rest of the answer would come when she had done enough to deserve it. He took her, that same afternoon, to see what the collapse of Nexora had actually looked like from the outside. She had not asked for this. She had not known she needed it. The first stop was an apartment in the Richmond district, where a former senior infrastructure engineer named Daniel was living with his wife and two school-aged children in a two-bedroom unit that was approximately 1/5 the size of Evelyn's executive office. Daniel had been one of Nexora's most technically accomplished architects, the kind of engineer who gets cited in 3 other people's patents. He had been laid off in the first round of workforce reductions after the board's actions went public, and the company's legal counsel recommended minimizing payroll liability. Daniel did not invite them in. He stood in the doorway with his arms folded, and the look on his face was not anger. Anger would have been easier, but a kind of thick, used-up disappointment. The expression of someone who has run out of available outrage and is left with only the residue of it. He said, "We thought you were different from the other CEOs. We thought Nexora was actually trying to do something." Evelyn stood on the landing and held his gaze and had nothing to offer him except the fact that she was there and not looking away. It was insufficient. She knew it was insufficient. The second stop was a coffee shop in the marina, where a former product manager named Sandra had taken a barista position because it was the only immediate work available, while the hiring pipeline for AI-adjacent companies in the city remained effectively frozen by the reputational fallout from SEMS, the Nexora collapse. Sandra was precise and professional with Evelyn. She did not say anything unkind. In some ways, that was harder to absorb than anger would have been. The third stop was a community center in the Sunset District, where 3 of Nexora's former junior engineers were spending their afternoons volunteering while they waited for their immigration status situations to resolve because the sudden, poorly managed layoffs had created complications with their work authorizations that no one from the company's legal or HR team had done anything to help address, because by the time those complications surfaced, the company's institutional infrastructure was already dissolving. Evelyn had not known about any of this, not in the way of someone who had investigated and dismissed it, but in the way of someone who had simply never looked at it at all, because looking at the human granularity of corporate decisions was not something her version of leadership had made room for. On the drive back, she said nothing for a long time. The city moved past the window in the way cities do when you are not looking at it as a backdrop to your own narrative. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I told myself the company's stability was too important to jeopardize on an internal investigation that might not produce anything." Noah kept his eyes on the road. "The company was its people," he said, "not the valuation." She watched the streetlights come on as the afternoon shifted toward evening. "You don't become a bad person in a single day," he said after a moment, "but you can stay quiet long enough that it adds up to the same thing." She did not argue. She did not have any argument left that she was willing to deploy in good faith. When they pulled back into the garage, she sat in the passenger seat for a moment and told him she was not going to file for bankruptcy. He didn't seem surprised by this. She told him she was going to fight to take the company back. He nodded once, with the quality of someone who had already accounted for this possibility, and opened his door. What followed was 3 weeks of work, unlike anything Evelyn had done before. She had always worked intensely, that was not new, but she had always worked intensely in the particular performance mode of senior corporate life. The prepared remarks, the calibrated decisiveness, the careful maintenance of a self that could be observed and would hold up under observation. Working out of Noah's garage stripped all of that away because there was no audience and no infrastructure to support the performance. There was a second-hand folding table and a reliable fiber connection, and whatever food Maya, Noah's daughter, brought down in the evenings, usually something she had heated herself, and delivered with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old who has been self-sufficient for long enough that it has become her natural register. Maya regarded Evelyn with direct, unadorned curiosity and absolutely no reverence, which Evelyn found, to her own surprise, to be something close to restful. She had been looked at with reverence for so long that the absence of it felt like setting down a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. Noah had kept records. This was the thing she had not anticipated, the variable that changed the shape of everything that followed. He had kept records of the internal memos, the buried compliance reports, the technical audit trails that had been quietly routed away from board visibility, the version histories of documents that had been altered between their original drafting and their official filing, the communication threads that had been archived in ways that were technically accessible but practically invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. He had kept them not as leverage and not with any premeditated plan to deploy them. He had kept them the way certain people keep records of important things because truth, when documented with sufficient care and sufficient patience, has a way of eventually becoming necessary. It was becoming necessary now. They spread everything across 2 folding tables in the garage and organized it first chronologically and then by category of violation, and what emerged from that organization was not merely evidence of what Marcus Webb had done but a clear, time-stamped architectural record of every institutional decision that had made Webb's actions not just possible but, in some structural sense, encouraged a system that had evolved over years to reward the precise behaviors that had ultimately destroyed it. Evelyn looked at that record for a long time. She looked at the specific documents she recognized, memos she had seen, decisions she had been adjacent to, flagged reports she had received and not acted on. She looked at them and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who can no longer maintain any useful degree of self-deception, exactly how much of this she had built herself. One small accommodation at a time. Each of them individually justifiable. All of them, collectively, catastrophic. Noah did not say anything while she came to this understanding. He gave her the time to get there without editorial comment, which she suspected was a harder thing to do than it appeared. They worked in the evenings, after Maya was in bed, and they argued sometimes sharply, with the particular friction of 2 people whose instincts point in genuinely different directions. Evelyn's instinct was always to move quickly, to go public before anyone could outmaneuver her, to use speed as a weapon the way she had always used it. Noah's instinct was always to build the case to a state of completeness before exposing any edge of it, because a case that is 90% complete and goes public early can be responded to. But a case that is fully sealed and released at once cannot. She pushed. He held. She pushed again. He explained, calmly and without condescension, exactly why the approach she was proposing would give the board's attorneys the opening they needed to discredit the documentation before it could reach the right audiences. She argued back, not because she thought he was wrong but because the habit of argument was deep in her, and she had to work through it to find the agreement on the other side. He waited for her to work through it. He never seemed frustrated by the process. She found this alternately impressive and infuriating. They were not naturally compatible in their strategic intuitions, and neither of them pretended otherwise. And Evelyn found this invigorating in a way she had not felt since the earliest years of the company, when disagreement still felt like information she could use, rather than a challenge to her authority. She was obliged to neutralize. She began to notice that she had spent the middle years of her career surrounding herself with people who had learned to agree with her, and that she had chosen this arrangement deliberately. And that the reason she had chosen it was something she did not especially like examining. She was afraid. She had been afraid for a long time that if she let anyone disagree with her hard enough and long enough, they would find something in her that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Noah disagreed with her hard and long, and nothing in her fell apart. She began to find that interesting in a way that had nothing to do with the case they were building. One evening, very late, after a disagreement about disclosure timing that had run for 90 minutes before resolving in his favor, she looked up from the document she was reviewing and watched him work for a moment without speaking. He was annotating a technical audit trail with the same focused quiet he brought to every task, and he hadn't noticed her looking, and she thought about what it was like to be around someone who was exactly the same, whether or not anyone was watching. She looked back at her document and said nothing. But she thought about it for a long time afterward. He did not treat her the way men in positions of power had typically treated her, as a variable to be managed, a credential to be leveraged, a challenge to be absorbed or deflected. He treated her as a person who was in the process of figuring something out, and he helped her figure it out. And that was the totality of his approach. She did not have a ready framework for this. She started paying more careful attention to what he actually said, and somewhat less attention to what she had initially assumed he must be thinking, which was its own kind of recalibration. Then the board made their formal move. The accusation arrived through her attorney at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning. Misappropriation of company funds, obstruction of an ongoing SEC inquiry, breach of fiduciary duty. The charges were constructed. She could see the architecture of them immediately. The way Webb's legal team had assembled a coherent narrative from selectively surfaced documentation and strategically absent context, but constructed charges, once made public, do something to a story that factual rebuttal cannot immediately undo. The press cycle accelerated back into full intensity. Several investors who had been quietly watching made public statements withdrawing support. A journalist who had written a profile of Evelyn 3 years earlier, one she had considered generous and accurate, now produced a piece that bore almost no resemblance to the person she believed herself to be. And then, a message arrived for Noah through an intermediary she recognized as connected to 2 board members. Disengage from Evelyn Carter and from any financial involvement in Nexora-related litigation, or Bennett Systems' pending partnership agreements with 2 major enterprise clients would experience complications. Noah read the message. He set his phone down. He went back to the technical documentation he had been reviewing. That evening he told Evelyn about it in the same tone he used to describe changes in the weather. She listened, she sat with it, and then, over the course of the following 2 hours, a decision that she recognized even as it was forming as both selfless and cowardly assembled itself in her mind, and she did not resist it. She was not going to let Noah lose his company because she had finally decided to do the right thing. She had already cost him a job once by choosing herself over what was correct. She was not going to cost him a $300 million enterprise by making that same essential choice again, dressed this time in the language of principle. The logic felt airtight. It also felt, she recognized in some part of herself she was trying not to listen to, like the most sophisticated excuse she had constructed in years. She left the garage without extended conversation, drove to the motel she had been staying in, packed what she had there into one bag, wrote a note on motel stationery in handwriting that was less steady than she would have liked, drove back before dawn and put the note through the mail slot. The note said, "I am not going to let you lose what you built because I finally decided to fight back. You gave me more than I deserved. Don't follow this." She drove north on the freeway, with her phone turned off, and checked into a different motel, under a name that was technically a nickname from childhood, and so not precisely false. She told herself this was the first truly unselfish decision she had made in years. She lay on the motel bed in the dark, and waited to feel certain about it. The certainty did not come. What came instead, at some point, after midnight, was the thought that she had spent her entire career making decisions that were defensible, that could be justified from multiple angles, that would hold up under the scrutiny of a board or a press release, and that defensible decisions were not the same thing as honest ones, and she had been confusing those 2 categories for longer than she wanted to admit. She was in that room for 31 hours. She ordered food from a place 2 blocks away that didn't require a name. She slept in intervals and thought in intervals and arrived at no conclusions that she was satisfied with. On the 32nd hour, there was a knock at the door, and it was Noah. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and then said, because she had to ask something, "How did you find me?" He said she had a pattern of decision-making that was less unpredictable than she believed. She let him in. He sat down on the single chair and told her that while she had been running, the board had advanced negotiations with a foreign-owned technology conglomerate for the acquisition of Nexora's core AI infrastructure assets, a transaction structured in such a way that the technology would be extracted from the company's legal entity, the remaining workforce would be dissolved, and the intellectual property would transfer to an offshore holding structure that would make any subsequent domestic litigation essentially unrecoverable. He said this without urgency, but with the quality of someone reporting the exact dimensions of a problem. "We have 72 hours, he said. "Possibly less." She sat on the edge of the motel bed and looked at her hands. "You came to find me," she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. "You were always going to come back," he said. "I just moved the timeline." She stood up and picked up her bag. The press conference was held in a downtown hotel ballroom chosen not for drama but for capacity and availability. The two largest rooms in the city that could be booked on 14 hours' notice and could accommodate the number of journalists Evelyn's publicist expected, plus the security presence Noah's contacts had arranged. She stood at the podium without notes. She had drafted a statement and discarded it. She had rehearsed an opening in the elevator on the way up and abandoned it before the doors opened. What she said into the wall of cameras and microphones, and the particular held-breath silence of a room full of people who are anticipating a collapse was this. She had made decisions, over several years, that had prioritized the maintenance of a particular appearance over the substance of what the company was supposed to stand for, and people who had trusted her judgment and invested their careers in the institution she built had paid the concrete price for those decisions, and she was not asking for sympathy. Then she asked for 47 minutes of attention, and through a secure digital display behind her, she presented 2 years' worth of documentation, internal communications, data transfer logs, technical audit trails with timestamps, the full structural record of what Marcus Webb and 3 board members had built, and the specific, dated moments at which each of them had made decisions that were not merely strategically wrong, but criminally actionable. The room was quiet, in a way that rooms rarely are. Halfway through the presentation, she could see 2 board members in the back exchange a look that meant their attorneys had already received calls. At the 50-minute mark, while she was still fielding questions from the floor, 2 federal agents came through the side entrance of the ballroom. They were not there for her. She watched them make their way through the crowd toward the back of the room, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction. It was more like the release of a pressure that had been building for so long. She had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. What came after the press conference was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions belong to stories that don't have to pass through regulatory investigation, shareholder litigation, and the slow machinery of corporate restructuring. The reality of the following months was messier and slower, and in some ways harder to navigate than the crisis itself had been. Because crises have a clarifying quality, they reduce decisions to their essentials, while recovery is full of ambiguity and competing pressures, and the exhausting work of rebuilding trust with people who have specific, legitimate reasons not to extend it easily. The foreign acquisition was blocked by federal intervention within 48 hours of the press conference. The SEC inquiry shifted its focus in the direction the documentation indicated it should. 3 board members were removed within the week, 2 of them facing criminal charges that would take years to fully adjudicate. Marcus Webb's attorney entered a plea negotiation. The company's stock, which had seemed like a number that had lost all connection to anything real, began to move again slowly, cautiously, with the particular quality of a market indicator that has been burned once and is not yet ready to believe in recovery. Nexora went into a controlled restructuring under independent oversight, with Evelyn in an advisory capacity initially, and then, as the new board took shape over the following months, in a formal leadership role defined differently from the one she had held before. Noah became a strategic advisor, which meant in practice that he attended certain board meetings, provided technical assessments that were taken seriously rather than filed, and occasionally disagreed with Evelyn in front of the full board in ways that she had specifically told him she would value, and which she still found, each time, to require a moment of adjustment. The company that emerged from restructuring was smaller than it had been, not by failure but by deliberate design, shedding the components that had existed primarily to serve valuation rather than to serve any legitimate function. The data policies were rewritten by engineers rather than by the legal department's understanding of what engineers would accept. The Ethics Oversight Board was given genuine authority to halt product decisions rather than the advisory role that earlier versions of the board had used to paper over real concerns. Profit sharing was written into employee agreements as a structural term rather than a discretionary benefit subject to quarterly performance reviews. It was not the $4.2 billion machine that had appeared on magazine covers. It was something smaller and harder to reduce to a headline, and in a way that Evelyn found she could not adequately articulate in the language of business metrics. More honest about what it was. She did not return as CEO with full executive authority. She proposed a different structure to the new board, and they accepted it. She would serve as executive chair focused on governance and long-term strategic direction, while day-to-day operations were led by a chief executive she had recruited from outside the company specifically because his professional history included 3 documented instances of telling his superiors they were wrong about something important and being subsequently proven correct. She thought he would be good at the job for exactly that reason. She thought about the woman she had been when she borrowed $40,000 against her mother's house and wrote in her first business plan that technology should work for people who couldn't afford to own it. She thought that woman would recognize what Nexora was trying to become. She was less certain that woman would fully recognize her. She decided the direction of travel mattered more than the current distance from the starting point. One evening, several months after the press conference, Evelyn drove back to the garage without any particular agenda. There was no meeting, no document to review, no decision requiring his input. Noah had a proper office now, a building with a lobby, an actual conference room, a receptionist who knew everyone's name and kept the calendar with genuine organizational intelligence. But she knew he still spent most evenings in the garage, because it was where he thought best, and because Maya's school was 3 blocks away, and the arrangement made logistical sense, and because some people, she had come to understand, simply prefer to work in spaces that are honest about being workspaces, rather than spaces that have been designed to project a particular kind of power. She found him working under a car, which seemed both entirely deliberate and entirely genuine, and she sat down on the concrete floor next to the wheel well without being invited, and told him she missed it here. He rolled out from under the car on a flat board and looked at her with the slightly raised expression of someone encountering a statement that requires a moment to process correctly. "You missed the part where everything was actively collapsing," he said. She thought about it for a real moment, not the rhetorical pause before a prepared answer, but actual consideration. "I missed the part where none of it was performed for anyone," she said. He considered that. Then he stood up and handed her a wrench. She looked at it. She had not held a tool of any description in her adult professional life. "Other side," he said, and went back under the car. She lay down on the concrete floor and found the bolt he was pointing to, and applied the wrench in the indicated direction, and the bolt turned. It was a small, physical, immediate thing with no larger significance attached to it. It was more satisfying than most of what had happened to her in the previous year, and she thought about why that might be for a while, without arriving at a complete answer, and decided the incomplete answer was enough. Maya came downstairs at some point with a plate of sandwiches, surveyed the situation with the frank assessment of a child who has learned not to be caught off guard by adults, and set the plate on the workbench. "You were on the news again," she told Evelyn with the conversational ease of someone discussing the weather. "Dad says you're not as bad as they make you sound on the business channel." Evelyn looked over at Noah, who was still focused on the undercarriage of the vehicle, and gave no indication of having heard this. "What does your dad say I am?" Evelyn asked. Maya considered the question with genuine seriousness. "He says you're still figuring yourself out," she said, "but you're not slow about it." She went back upstairs. Evelyn turned back to the bolt she was working on, and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your daughter is going to be genuinely terrifying." From under the car, Noah said, "I know. I'm very proud of it." Later, after the car was finished, and the sandwiches were eaten, and the garage had settled into the particular quiet of late evening, Noah went to a drawer in the workbench and pulled out the check. The original one, the blank one, with the signature and the empty amount line. It had a fold crease in it from being put away and taken out more than once. He set it on the workbench between them, without comment. She looked at it. "You kept it," she said. He said, "in case you came back and needed it." She picked it up and held it for a moment, looking at the signature, at the empty space where a number should have been. Then she set it back down on the bench and pushed it toward him. "I don't need rescuing anymore," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, Not performing consideration. Actually considering. Something shifted in his expression in the small, specific way of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing and has just heard it arrive. Good, he said. Because I never wanted to rescue the company. He paused. I wanted to see if you'd rescue yourself. She was quiet. The garage was quiet. Outside came the ambient sound of the city, in its late evening register, distant and indifferent and continuous. Is there a difference? She said. Yeah, he said. One of them I could do for you, the other one I couldn't. She looked at him across the workbench. Then, what was the check for? He picked it up and looked at it for a moment, and set it back down. A question, he said, to see if you knew the difference between money and a chance. She thought she understood now what the question had always been, and what it had taken her this long to answer correctly. The small television in the corner of the garage, old, with a physical dial that Maya found historically fascinating and occasionally demonstrated for friends as a kind of artifact from a vanished era, was playing a late news broadcast. Through the general ambient sound of the room, she heard the anchor say, Nexora Tech officially returns to operation under new governance structure, marking what analysts are calling one of the more unusual corporate recoveries in recent Silicon Valley history. The graphic behind the anchor was measured and professional, and entirely stripped of the drama that story had generated for the better part of a year. There was a photograph of Evelyn on screen, from the press conference, looking directly at the camera with an expression she remembered having, without quite remembering making. She did not recognize herself in it, in the way she had once recognized herself in press photographs, with the particular satisfaction of seeing a constructed image that matched the image she had worked to construct. This was just a person. She reached over without looking, and turned the television off. The garage became quieter. Noah glanced at the television, then at her. She said nothing. He said nothing. The rain that had been threatening since mid-afternoon began outside the bay door, arriving with the sound of something patient that has finally decided the waiting is done. She picked up a cloth from the workbench and started cleaning off the surface, because it was covered in the residue of the evening's work, and it needed doing, and she was there, and no one was observing whether she did it or not, and no one would know whether she had or hadn't, and she did it anyway. It was the most unremarkable thing she had done in years. She thought it might be the most accurate. She thought it might also be the most honest account of who she was right now, someone cleaning a workbench in a garage, without an audience, because it was the right thing to do with the next 5 minutes. Noah watched her for a moment from across the garage, and then went to the small sink in the corner, and filled the kettle, because it was late and cold and the coffee from earlier had long gone cold, and starting again from the kettle was the kind of small, practical kindness that she had come to understand was his native register, not grand gestures, not deliberate demonstrations of character, just the continuous, quiet maintenance of the conditions that made being in a room together sustainable. She thought she had spent her entire career confusing grand gestures with substance. She thought the garage had been teaching her the difference for months. She thought about the girl who had gone to business school on 2 scholarships and a night job, and written a plan about technology serving people who couldn't afford to own it. She thought about the long, specific distance between that girl and the woman who had stood in a dark office watching her own fall scroll across a television screen. She thought about the distance between that woman and where she was standing now, on a concrete floor, in a garage, in the eastern part of a city that had never particularly cared about her story, next to a man who had been right about everything that mattered and had never once made her feel small for having been wrong. The distances were not nothing. They were also not the most important thing about the geography. The direction of travel was the most important thing. And the direction was the right one, and she knew it in a way that did not require confirmation from any external source. That was new. That was, she thought, perhaps the most significant thing that had changed. Outside, the rain came down steadily, and the city went on being itself indifferent, continuous, already moving toward the next story, and inside the garage, the light was warm, and the kettle was beginning to sound, and the work of the evening was real and finished, and the workbench was clean and getting cleaner. Evelyn Carter set down the cloth and looked across the room at Noah Bennett, who was setting 2 mugs on the counter with the unhurried ease of someone for whom this moment requires no special performance, no heightened awareness of its own significance. He looked back at her. The rain came down outside the open bay door, and the city glowed beyond it, and neither of them moved to close it, because the sound of the rain coming in was part of what made the room feel like itself, and there was nowhere either of them needed to be, and for the first time in as long as she could remember. That was exactly enough. Evelyn Carter set down the cloth.